Welcome, everyone. I'm Liesl Olson with the Newberry Library. Thank you for joining us for this evening's program, which is called Extinguishing the Myths of the Great Chicago Fire. Today's program celebrates Carl Smith's book, I have it right here, called Chicago's Great Fire, The Destruction and Resurrection of an Iconic American City. Our event is co-sponsored with the Chicago History Museum in connection with its current exhibition, which is called City on Fire, Chicago 1871, and with the Chicago Collections Consortium. The Newberry and the Chicago History Museum are founding members of the CCC, a consortium of over 60 cultural organizations, all working together for the promotion and preservation of Chicago's rich history. Visit newberry.org to learn more about the Newberry's many digital resources, online classes, and public programs. During the program, please enter questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom or in the comments section if you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube. Now, I'd like to introduce Erica Griffin, Chicago History Museum's Elizabeth F. Cheney Director of Education. Erica.
Thank you so much, Liesl, for the introduction, and greetings to you all joined here this evening. The Chicago History Museum is excited to partner with our colleagues at Newberry Library and the Collectors Consortium and tonight's speakers in an exploration of the history and lasting impact of this essential Chicago story at its critical 150th anniversary year. As Liesl mentioned, this particular program has been developed in part to support Chicago History Museum's latest exhibition, City on Fire, Chicago 1871. Designed with youth and family and intergenerational conversation in mind, City on Fire provides context into Chicago at the time, a rapidly growing city made of wood, a summer and early fall boasting perfect conditions for conflagration and social and economic tensions smoldering away. All that was needed for the fire to start was a spark. To support the exhibition, a robust roster of K-12 classroom and educator engagement and public engagement for all ages has been developed, and I encourage you all to visit the exhibition website, chicago1871.org, for additional information on upcoming events, programs, experiences, and more. I would also like to take time to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Institute of Museums and Library Services for their generous contributions in support of the City on Fire exhibition project. Back to you, Liesl.
It's so great to partner with you again, Erica. I love it. All right, I want to introduce our three speakers for tonight. Carl Smith first, and Carl and Adam and Julius, you all can join us now so everybody can see your faces. Here's Carl. Carl is Franklin Bliss Snyder Professor of English and American Studies and Professor of History Emeritus at Northwestern University. He's written 4 books on Chicago and urban history, most recently, Chicago's Great Fire, The Destruction and Resurrection of an Iconic American City. And I will say there's been so much written about the Chicago fire. And I think your book, Carl, is truly the best synthesizer. It is so readable and deeply researched. It's really the book that we've been waiting for. So I thank you for that. Carl is also author and curator of 2 major online exhibitions, which he produced in collaboration with Northwestern University and CHM. Their websites are called The Great Chicago Fire and the Web of Memory, and The Dramas of Haymarket. Julius Jones is curator at Chicago History Museum. He curated City on Fire, Chicago 1871. He's a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of Chicago, where his scholarly interests include 20th century US cultural and social history, particularly the meanings of aspiration among racial and ethnic minorities with a focus on Chicago. Welcome, Julius. And Adam Green is Associate Professor of History in the College and Master of the Social Science Collegiate Division at the University of Chicago. He teaches and researches US history, African American history, and the history of Black Chicago. He's also been involved in community-based initiatives in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles related to police accountability and educational justice. Adam is also the author of the extraordinary book, Selling the Race, Culture and Community in Black Chicago, 1940 to 1955. I've learned so much from Adam and from his work, and particularly from that book, and really from all three of our speakers here tonight. So it's going to be great to have you all in conversation. What we thought we'd do is really start off by having Julius tell us a little bit about the exhibition, which I was lucky to see yesterday. It was really wonderful. And then we'll all join back together again for a conversation. So Adam and Carl and I will kind of go off screen. We'll give it the floor to you, Julius, and then we'll join back in when you're finished. On to you, Julius.
Well, thank you, Liesl, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Again, my name is Julius Jones, and I was the curator of the exhibition City on Fire, Chicago 1871. And it was to commemorate what is the sesquicentennial or 150th anniversary of the event. And for us, our goal from the very beginning was taking this story, which many of us know, some very, very well, others bits and pieces, and making it accessible to a new generation of Chicagoans. And as I've reflected on the exhibition in the nearly a month since it's open, I really have focused on the idea that the pandemic, right, and working on this during COVID-19 really animated the way we approach the exhibition and our ideas of talking about recovery, resilience, perseverance, ideas that scholars like Carl Smith and others had long talked about the fire. And what we specifically focused on is this idea that even though people have the same experiences of an event, they don't experience that event the same way. And in the idea of the fire story, it was very clear to us that there were differences in how people experienced the fire, how people experienced recovering from the fire, the way that they were treated as they attempted to recover from the fire, and that those differences were very important to highlight because we saw similar things happening with the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically how people discuss this idea of there being social inequities that existed previously that the recovery offered an opportunity to address. And I think we heard a lot of that around the pandemic, that recovering from the pandemic was an opportunity to build a more equitable city, state, country. I think we heard a lot of that from many of our elected leaders. But what was fascinating was you heard very little of that after the Great Chicago Fire. In many ways, those charged with managing the recovery from the fire committed themselves to reestablishing the pre-fire status quo. And so for us, it was important then to communicate to our guests and our audience, what was that status quo? What was Chicago like in 1871? What was the city that caught on fire? And that really informed our approach to the exhibition, setting the context for how this fire was able to spread so rapidly. The fact that Chicago was a city made almost entirely out of wood with highly flammable materials, just in abundant supply around the city, things that we might not think about now, such as coal and poop from animals, as urban farming was so common during this period. From there, we also talk about the social inequalities that existed in Chicago in 1871, how Chicago was a city that where nearly half of Chicagoans were born outside of the United States. And then you add that to their children who are first generation Americans, And the overwhelming majority of Chicagoans are either immigrants or first-born Chicagoans in 1871. Yet there are divisions between this immigrant or immigrant descendant first generation Chicagoans between Protestant moneyed Anglo-Saxon elite who blame immigrants who are disproportionately Catholic from places like Germany and Ireland. They blame them for all of Chicago's social ills. And that is the context that we encounter people like Patrick and Catherine O'Leary. They are Irish Catholic immigrants. Patrick was a day laborer who was a Civil War veteran, having fought for the Union. And Catherine, a small businesswoman who owned a milk farming business. She had a barn with cows, and she would sell their milk throughout her neighborhood to help support her family. And we wanted to humanize the O'Learys to dispel this myth, but not only just dispel the myth of her milking her cow at night and Chicago being the city that the cow kicked over, but really explaining where that came from, what was the context of that, and why in many ways Mrs. O'Leary is a stand-in, a scapegoat for a group of people who are being blamed for a whole host of social ills and problems in Chicago in 1871. And because of that group being blamed for issues before the fire, after the fire, it was only natural that someone from that class be blamed for the fire, and having the misfortune of having the fire start in and around her barn really sealed her fate in a lot of ways. And that blame that we saw for the social ills at the beginning animated the way people were treated as they sought to recover for the fire. People like the O'Learys were treated with suspicion as they sought to seek aid and relief from the Chicago Relief and Aid Society, who had prominent moneyed men such as George Pullman and Marshall Field on their board. And even though the Relief and Aid Society did an admirable job with this Herculean task of managing a recovery in the age of no government appropriation, no FEMA, no emergency response department, they also informed their work with ideas of deserving and undeserving poor, in that while no one should be worse off because of the fire, no one should be better off after the fire either. So again, reestablishing that pre-fire status quo, returning people back to their exact place in Chicago's social hierarchy was something that really imbibed their work. And in many ways, the dissatisfaction that comes out of the way the recovery is handled leads to some of the social unrest we see at the end of the 19th century, with things like Haymarket, like the Pullman strike, and all of these other sorts of social upheavals that existed. But also the fire in a lot of ways cleanses the palate and allows Chicago to grow into metropolis and continue on its path of being the fastest growing city in the world at the end of the 19th century. Because the land is cleared and Chicago literally grows, you can see the shoreline expand out from the rubble from the fire being pushed into Lake Michigan. Ultimately, you'll see the growth continue that leads to the skyscraper and other innovations. And then that will culminate with Chicago hosting the World's Columbian Exhibition in 1893, cementing itself as a quintessential American city, being selected by Congress to host the World's Fair. And these two events, the fire and the fair, leading to Chicago having a moniker that has fallen out of use now, but we would refer to as the Phoenix City, the mythical bird who burned too hot and was destroyed, but resurrected itself from its own ashes. That's what Chicago was. And Chicagoans accepted that mythology about themselves deeply. That's why on the original flag, now the flag has 4 stars, but originally had 2 stars, and those 2 stars represented the fire and the fair. And that's been the way Chicagoans have sort of conceptualized themselves and their identity for a long time. And so with that, I think I want to open up the floor to the real experts to discuss further.
Great. Thanks so much, Julius. Yes, Carl and Adam, if you'll join us again too. Julius, one of the things that you're really underscoring, and I think the exhibition underscores. So don't go away, Julius. Keep on. There you are. That a fire may be democratic, right? It will burn away anywhere and anyone and anything, but the recovery efforts in Chicago were a different story in terms of a kind of democratic impulse. And I think you've also pointed out one of the myths that you're extinguishing through this exhibition, and that's certainly related to stories around Mrs. O'Leary and her cow and her barn, right? Which is not where your exhibition begins, which is wonderful. So Carl, I wanted to start then or continue with you and just thinking a little bit more about those myths. Let's talk about the myths of Chicago, the myths of the fire. The one chapter of your book is titled "Chicago Shall Rise Again," right? Like a phoenix, like the phoenix that Julius was discussing, the Phoenix City as Chicago was known. So tell us, is that one of the myths that is worth extinguishing? The myth of the heroic city rising out of the ashes.
No, history is very rarely, yes or no. It's usually both and. Chicago's recovery after the fire is absolutely remarkable, as the destruction. It never lost population, and again, within 20 years, it grew from 3 times to 1 million to the second biggest city in the United States. Both the entrepreneurs and the working people of Chicago deserve a great deal of credit, but it's best understood in terms of the times that the world, the developing national international economy needed a place like Chicago, and it was outside money that first built Chicago, and then it was outside money that then rebuilt it again as an important nexus in this developing international industrial economy. So yes, the story of the heroic rebirth is largely substantial, but it's due to a more complicated series of what can I say, larger circumstances of the time, and also how heroic is a qualitative word. As Julius hinted at, the fire both revealed and, I fear, deepened divisions within the city of Chicago, particularly along the lines of class and ethnicity, which closely correlated in many ways, and creating a lot of bad feelings and mutual suspicions, which redound in very negative ways for the next few decades.
Yes, I think I understand what you're saying, and I know that Adam has engaged deeply with your book. And as somebody, Adam, you've written so powerfully about Chicago, really decades later after the fire. I'm curious, how you think about the city's rebuilding in the wake of the fire, and what did it build in relationship to? That is, what ideas did the city express in its built environment in those decades following the fire?
Well, so first of all, it's a wonderful opportunity to be able to join this panel, and particularly to have the chance to talk to Carl, Professor Smith, who is an old friend and also a really, really revered colleague when I was first starting at Northwestern. and to see Julius Jones, who is somebody who comes out of the program at the university and someone who I've worked with closely and continue to look forward to doing so. I think that question it's both one that suggests going very far into the future after 1871, but you can see some of the seeds, I think, even in the years immediately after. And, to my mind, I might suggest a couple of things and then appeal to Carl to detail some other points from his wonderful book about the ways in which conflict was lived out. So, on the one hand, I think a question comes up as to whether or not what grew out of the fire were new inequalities or standing inequalities, ones that showed that in many ways the fire offered an opportunity for particular elites to, as it were, double down on the ways in which particular sorts of hierarchies, particular kinds of exclusions, particular kinds of social places could be, recovered and in a certain sense really reinforced. And I think here, thinking about the ways in which relief was distributed as another form of rebuilding, that in a certain sense, people needed food, people needed shelter, people needed, a certain sense that there was a reordering of society. And one of the things that I took away that was very powerful, and I have to say, very resonant in terms of the ways in which processes and institutions of social management, social administration operated in Chicago during the 20th century, say the real estate market in terms of enforcing segregation, or the police in terms of providing differential experiences in terms of the obligation to kind of obey and defer before the law, or even public housing, as a kind of system that was intended for a particular class. I feel like you can see the seeds of that in some ways in the workings, for instance, of something like the Chicago Relief and Aid Society, which on the one hand, sort of effectively delegates for itself and is empowered by the mayor immediately after the fire to not only distribute and coordinate relief within the city, but coordinate, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Carl, something approaching $8 or $9 million potentially in both dollars and in-kind donations and materials to try to administer the recovery of the city, to a degree that probably dwarfed many, if not most, recovery efforts in other cities. But when one steps back from that, that's an extraordinary amount of power to grant a committee of a few dozen citizens who then institute a range of measures ranging from the necessity of personal recommendations for everybody who applies for relief to, in a sense, a kind of profiling in relation to what's the ethnicity in relation to people that are applying for relief and whether or not they could be counted on to be people that would be reliable workers within the city order, or whether they were people that run the risk of becoming indigent. These are, the kind of conditions that remind us that maybe the fire was not an event that unified Chicago, but it was surely an event that ordered Chicago.
Right.
And the ways in which events order a city and order a community are very consequential in terms of how then people downstream at later points in history think about appropriate and inappropriate structures of order. So
right.
I think, to my mind, what comes out of it is just really paying attention to the conceptions of social order, the conceptions of social hierarchy, the conceptions of credible leadership, and the conceptions of credible citizenry that are applied to the entire city after that.
So maybe let's lay it out a little bit specifically. In the wake of the in the wake of the fire, who are the people? Who are the leaders? I mean, who are the people presiding over the Chicago Relief and Aid Society that did such a massive job of rebuilding? Carl, maybe you can give us a sense of those personalities.
Yeah, I think we have to back up just a little bit.
Sure.
As Julius talked about, there was no social safety net, but one of the most remarkable things about the fire was this spontaneous outpouring of aid from around the country and around the world, Japan, Germany, all over. And as Adam said, when you put it all together, somewhere in the range of about $10,018,71, over $200,020,21 are sent to the people of Chicago. And this small group, the Chicago Relief and Aid Society, a small philanthropy, which is largely made up of this Yankee elite that Julius also talked about, convinces the mayor in a kind of a coup to entrust the administration of the money to it. There is a civic committee that's there for a few days, and they sort of take over. And this is in the context of their fears about ethnic and working people controlling the city and taking the money and building it their way. And at this time, this is again part of a larger thing where about 60% of the voters are these people, and they're represented in the Common Council, the predecessor of the City Council. And the Relief and Aid Society is deadly afraid of these people sort of taking over. And they want, as Julius said, the city to be rebuilt their way. And so they manage the relief according to a way of their conception of the city. They work endlessly. They do a remarkable job, but they're incapable of distinguishing between their interests and the good of the city and others. And they basically tie such things as getting aid to working the way we want you to work, and treating anyone who asks for aid with suspicion, and being very concerned about people this is one way it resonates today, people getting aid without effort, that creating further indigence or not building the city that we want. There are related things as well. They're not particularly concerned about the fact that a shortage in housing creates higher rents, but they are concerned that a shortage of labor will raise higher wages. So they want to keep wages down, but don't worry about things in their interests. They're incapable of seeing the difference between their interests and those of the people. As Julius said, 1 in 5 people in Chicago are born in Germany. They have, in interviewing these people, they have no people who speak German. They require forms to be filled out. It's very bureaucratic, and a number of people who can't write have to do it. It's reorganizing the city in some ways, what they feel is slipping away from their control in a way that they want it to be, and applying certain kinds of pressures, which in the longer run create kinds of reactions and resentments that, as I said, lead into greater friction through the 70s and 80s. In some ways, what is interesting here is how this group reacts, not just after the fire, but when the Panic of 1873 strikes. By this time, the city is very substantially rebuilt, but then a very substantial financial depression hits and people are out of work, and the Relief and Aid Society still has this money given to the people of Chicago, and they still say, and people are saying, give it to us, and there's these massive rallies, we need it, we're starving, and they again say, apply, get a person we trust to recommend you, and then we'll think about it. And people are radicalized by this in ways that developed through the 1870s and 1880s.
Right. I mean, it seems like, all 3 of you have profoundly illuminated the social dimensions of the fire, right? I mean, there's a way we could be having a conversation about how did it get started, and where did it spread, and when did it jump the river, and what was the exact nature of the devastation, and how many lives and how many homes, right? Which is actually extremely important as well, right? But in some ways, that history has been so well trodden that coming out of a pandemic, and Julius, you touched on this, it seems that our point of focus is really the kind of human and social dimension and political dimension of the fire. So let's step back a minute in terms of questions around the fire being a kind of natural disaster or social or man-made disaster, right? Which we were chatting about a little bit before the program began. And we have questions coming in the Q&A, quite a few, one of which is really focused on that issue of how the fire got started, and the question of arson too, at the start of your book, Carl. How do we understand the kind of natural versus man-made disaster? How do we think through whether, one or the other? Again, both and, I know, to your point, Carl. Adam or Julius, if you want to take a stab at that question, or you all three can, right?
Well, there's no such thing as a natural disaster in a city. In San Francisco, you build a city where there's earthquake prone. You can't say this is a natural disaster.
Right. Right.
But what's going on here is in some ways, and with the attempt to blame Mrs. O'Leary, is not only put the blame on these irresponsible people, but to deflect it from the fact that we have built this place quickly and sloppily and made it so prone, and that we have too small a fire department. And in our rush to grow, we're not taking very good care of ourselves. I let maybe Adam or Julius would like to speak to this too.
I mean, maybe one observation also in addition to that is that there's also an embrace of the idea that we're not only building rapidly, but we want to be positioned to continue to build rapidly. So wood is stockpiled. So tar and turpentine are ready at hand. So different forms of flammable material are close by. So workers are put into close quarters with one another so that they can move quickly to places where they can provide labor. I mean, that's in a sense the sort of economic organization of society to supply kindling for something like a fire, in the same sort of way that a pandemic will rush through a community in which work is organized particular ways, politics has been decided to particularly divisive levels, and people are not sort of willing to trust, public health measures coming from central authorities. So it does underscore that point that any natural disaster that reaches scale at that level is probably being fueled in part by fundamental contradictions in the social organization.
And then also this idea that someone has to be blamed, right? It can't just be an accident, a misfortune of fate. Someone has to be responsible, and thus someone deserves blame for something of this magnitude. And one of the things that struck me is just how common fires were in Chicago. They're multiple day occurrences. You're having large fires. It just so happens that this is the fire that had the combination of time and flammable material, and the unfortunate sort of human error and fatigue of the fire department and firefighting apparatus, that it grows out of control very rapidly. But it could have been any number of fires that occurred in Chicago daily, that could have been the one that spread. And it is but a fate of history that it happens to be this one. And even before the fire was out, there was a need, an attempt to assign blame. And I think Mrs. O'Leary was highly blamable because of her social identity.
Right. She was both a woman and an Irish, woman, right?
And an immigrant and Catholic. And what's
Catholic,
there's
right?
there's a certain comfort in blaming her too, because what it does is, when something bad happens, you try to explain it, and there's a kind of intellectual framework that's at risk here as well. And so what this does is it reaffirms this story of Mrs. O'Leary, reaffirms this idea of the way things are, and that fire is, and any kind of problem is something that happens to a city from the outside and is not inherent in it. And even some of the Yankee elite, someone like one of the most trenchant analyses of the fire is a few weeks after by Frederick Law Olmsted writing in The Nation saying, and he doesn't even talk about any in terms of Mississippi, he just said a commonplace fire. How can a commonplace fire burn down a city? It's because we built it so poorly. But he still has this elitist thing. What can I say? Wise and trusted men, expert people like me, basically, the best men, as a phrase of this period, should be in charge. What's going on here is a very strong anti-democratic sense that you can't trust the people to govern themselves.
Yeah.
And it's a real questioning of both, what I call the urban democracy in the most profound way.
Right.
This really is it seems to me a very important point that bears on what we learned from 1871 and can apply to 2021 and beyond, which is that we can appreciate that political and social analysis opens out the ways in which the fire has disparate and maybe even divergent impact on different communities. But that governance and how governance is organized is a really key component of how we understand and then subsequently how we remember any disaster, any kind of conflagration, any challenge that impacts a community of scale. And this is an extraordinary history in part because of the ways in which governance is reorganized, governance is distributed, governance, as you said a moment ago, Carl, is taken in a certain sense without necessarily having been granted. And then governance is remembered. And I think certain lessons come from that sense that governance worked because the city was rebuilt, that then shelter or cloak or veil the degree to which continuations of those forms of governance tend to make it more difficult to speak to the kinds of inequalities, the kinds of underlying social tensions that persist in a city like Chicago, up until the present day. So I think that point that this is remembered and experienced in particular ways because of how authority is organized, as well as how human experience played out is important.
Right. And I think that, that leads me to the question kind of Chicago's exceptionality. If that's a real thing here. I mean, there's a question in the Q&A, and I've had this question many times that, in the late 19th and 20th century, many major North American cities had catastrophic fires. Why is it that the Chicago fire is so central and so defining of the city? Is there something exceptional about its leadership or lack of? It's the way that there are divisions that were exacerbated, the city's built environment. What is it about our history that puts the fire so central to it?
I think you have to take into account, what can I say, not just in relative terms, but absolute terms. Certainly, there's fires everywhere throughout the 19th century. But one thing you have to just understand, this is really big. It is much larger than any one before it and any one until the San Francisco earthquake and fire, which has a similar kind of legendary spot. It's on the scale with Moscow in 1812 and London in 1666. But the key thing here is that already Chicago, in some ways, as this, as Julius said, this fastest growing city. It represented urbanization in America. It represented modernity. And the fire hitting it was basically a confrontation between modernity and, how was it going to go? And so it takes almost immediately this kind of symbolic value. And why we see the phoenixes and the revival and so on. I think it can be framed in those kinds of terms as a kind of contest between human aspiration in the 19th century and the direction of industrialization and the communications and transportation revolution and the westward movement, all put on trial and found not wanting in all of this, that as a kind of triumphant thing. But it's far more complicated than that. I mean, in ways we're talking about too. About how it reveals things that are also emblematic about divisions, about, again, particularly ones according to class and ethnicity.
Right. I mean, Carl,
Yeah. Oh.
you said Chicago is one of the few places that celebrates its destruction.
Mm-hmm.
That seemed to me something particular to this city. And I guess that's what I meant about with the question about Chicago's exceptionality, right? What is it about us that we're celebrating our own destruction?
Well, some of it has to do with quirks. One of the remarkable things about the Great Chicago Fire is how few people died, and how few, what can I say, and almost all the deaths are anonymous deaths.
What were the numbers? What were the number of deaths?
Well, it's hard to know exactly, but the consensus estimates about 300 people in a city of 330,000 people. As I talk about later in the book, twice that many people died in the Iroquois Theater fire, and even more in the Eastland disaster. But the point is what the story of the fire quickly becomes a story of the recovery, the phoenix, that the fire then gets kind of framed as the kind of moment of rebirth, a kind of second birth for the city after this kind of prelude in which, again, modernity triumphs, in which the I will spirit of Chicago triumph. There is this figure who has invented the I will woman, who has a crown with a phoenix in her hair coming out of it and a breastplate that says "I will" on it. This ties into the city that works. The city that's no nonsense. The city that's tough and resilient in all that way. Again, which is much more complicated because in another emblematic way, it's the city where, again, Haymarket happens, the worst of the labor conflicts, the Pullman strike, the most legendary of the strikes, and I might say some good things, where Hull House is founded as well. That this is the grand urban democratic experiment. That's a kind of ongoing thing, and Chicago is the place where it's happening, the stage for it all.
There are many people tuning in who have stories from their own families that have clearly been passed on to them about experiencing the fire, which, to your point, Carl, I mean, reminds us that this is relatively recent history, and our city is still so young in comparison to so many other American and cities worldwide. There's a question about German immigrants and whether there's any record of how immigrants to the city felt the kind of mental effects of the fire. Let's see, the kind of ongoing trauma of having lived through something like this. That's one question. There's another question about whether any objects from the fire were found that were buried in the sands. There's a story that has been passed on to one viewer about how the relatives, fled and went out to the lake and buried a lot of their things there. So two different kinds of questions, but coming out of a sense of this history that has been passed down through Chicago.
Well, one of the things, I mean, we're talking in very large terms.
Yes.
One of the things I really wanted to do was get this down to a more granular level and certainly a more human level. And this book tries to tell the experience of the fire through the eyes of the people who went through it, who passed through the fire in kind of almost biblical sense. So the core of the research is on personal accounts or first person things. And you get all these about people will have the sense of loss. This Irish Catholic woman thinking that evening she went to Holy Name for Vespers, and that's where she was basically raised. She'll never be there again. Or a person saying, a wealthier woman saying she can rebuild a new house, but I lost the garments of the baby who died in infancy, my mother's Bible, my wedding dress, the sense of some sense of self. So on a very existential sense, it's deeply traumatic in all kinds of ways that are very, very troubling for people, and something that they kind of have to get over. As far as this talk about German immigrants in particular, again, it's part of, again, a larger story. You come from this great distance, you come to this place, and this includes even the Americans. A lot of the leadership are from New England and New York, and you build yourself up as you build up a city. Chicago is got maybe 100 people in 1830 and 330,000 in 1871. And then in 30 hours, poof, it's gone. And the other thing, the reason that Chicago's not the fire is, remember, it's not only the size of it, but it burned the downtown, the heart of the city. And then you roll up your sleeves and we rebuild ourselves, we do it again. And it's a sense of making of selves and making of this place that are tied together. And the sense of loss in many ways gets what can I say, pushed down. Again, in that article by Olmsted, he talks about, you talk to people and you see them, what can I say, they're kind of strength of character, but then you see that he talks about their eyes tearing up and this sense of thing. And that gets repressed and gets turned into this idea of rebuilding and recovery and resurrection and so on. That it turned in the most positive way.
Right. Adam, you wanted to jump in. Yes.
Yeah, I think around that question of trauma, because there's also a question here about how many people were displaced. And while there were only 300 casualties, 100,000 people, if I remember correctly, Carl, were without homes and were finding shelter that only came up after a week or 2 weeks. They were trying to find their bearings when not only buildings and their homes, but street signs, landmarks, everything was gone. So that, the question of how you orient yourself is one that's a real challenge at that point. I think Hiroshima is a really interesting analogy to this. So one can project oneself back to that and think about oneself, say, as an immigrant laborer or as an immigrant adult, head of family, male or female, or as an immigrant child, and say, what would be the experience, for instance, of seeking relief when one could not step back and kind of cope with the trauma and the injury and the anxiety and the uncertainty that one had gone through, presumably by escaping this conflagration, because one had to report immediately either to a job that had been assigned to them, maybe miles away, or one had to procure the sufficient recommendations and bona fides to prove that one was worthy and deserving of relief. So I think it's important to really recognize that, the frameworks that were set in place didn't afford people the opportunity, in a sense, to grieve or engage in self-care or think about some of the things that we understand now as requisite to overcoming various moments of social calamity. Another point, I just want to throw this in really quickly, is that I thought that the way that Carl spoke about all of the reasons why Chicago becomes exceptional in terms of thinking about a major American city recovering from disaster were very compelling. There's one other that might be there too, which is that people were able to craft a simple narrative out of a very complicated history. So it's a fire, a woman's cow kicks over a lantern, the city burns, unfortunately, everybody comes together and rebuilds the city. And one of the things that I think about as a historian in relation to that is how convenient it is, because effectively, really, that's the origin story of the modern Chicago. One could make an argument for the Columbian Exposition in terms of Chicago's status as a global city. But insofar as Chicago emerges as a city that's on the trajectory to growth and a kind of preeminence in terms of how it signifies different procedures, it's really after 1871. Well, depending on how you calculate things, whether it's the treaties where the Potawatomis cede over land to those that have pushed them out, whether it's the Fort Dearborn massacre, there are plenty of other events in the past, but they're more complicated. They're a little less innocent in some cases. They're far more bloody. They're much more rooted within actual conditions of conflict.
Right.
And so I think that in some ways, one of the reasons why this story is both precious to Chicago and exceptional is because people invest in it a kind of forward-looking origins narrative that is very hard to dislodge because
Right. I mean,
it's so
very
simple
hopeful.
and so, kind of homespun.
Right.
Well,
It is.
Yeah, as the Relief and Aid Society took over the relief, I mean, in many ways, the Chamber of Commerce took over the anniversaries. Onward we build are the thing, and you see the iconography of a fire and skyscrapers rising out of it. That this complicated thing. What I don't want to lose track of before is, yes, lots of people did bury things, even stories of pianos being.
Thank you. We
buried.
want to hear about the stuff. Yes.
Even things of people burying pianos, which doesn't make any sense to me, but I've read so many accounts of that I can only assume they're true. And again, the sense of then unearthing this and going on with your life.
Right.
But this, again, but Adam's point about simplicity is very important. After the fire, you talk about how people focus on a certain issue to explain everything in this period of discontent and disorder after the fire. And again, members of the Yankee elite focus on an issue which we've lost sight of: temperance. That if we just enforce the laws against drinking, everything will be fine. And how convenient those laws against drinking are really against the Irish and the Germans.
And magically, it'll happen with a police force of 300 in a city of 300,000.
Right.
Well,
right.
And even the mayor at this point, Medill, says, in exactly those terms, we don't have enough policemen to check on there are so many more saloons than there are policemen in this city. But it's a desperate attempt to, again, assert control.
Right.
Liesl,
Yes.
could I ask a question of Julius? I'm just
Yes, please
curious
do.
on that
Yes, I wanted
question
to
of
circle
personal
back.
effects and memorabilia and the like. What's been your experience, Julius, in terms of people responding to the exhibition by talking about either objects lost or found that kind of resonate with their personal memory of the fire?
Because there's a great display of so many of these objects, some of them half melted. I mean, it's just wonderful to see. Yeah, so much of the collection there in the exhibition.
Yeah, that's a great question. People really connect to objects, particularly ones that they can draw a personal connection to. I'm particularly struck by the way people respond to things like keys. So we have a section where we have keys from buildings that were destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire. And we ask, in the interpretive text, what would you do with the keys to your home or your business if it was destroyed in a fire, right? And that's something that gets people thinking. We also have the coat of a man named Samuel Greeley who, wore this coat through the fire. And we sort of say, like, imagine surviving the fire with nothing but the clothes on your back, right? And then, famously, we have the painting and recollection by Julia Lemos, and we sort of ask, how would you process a difficult experience? What would you create to process a difficult experience? And those connections, I think, are really powerful, and they really help people. I think, to the point Carl brought earlier, it gets it out of the clouds and makes it real and tangible of something that's accessible.
When we did the Great Chicago Fire in the Weber Memory, the emblem, one of the emblems is this doll called Bessie that this girl went back into the house to get. Again, after you save your life, what else are you going to try to say? And this sense of this connection to this past, a kind of continuity there that is very, very important to people.
Yes. And I think, Julius, one of the things that you all, CHM, have done so well with this exhibition is thinking about what a young person, a child, would want to learn about a fire, want to learn about this moment in Chicago history. And so walking through the exhibition in some ways is like walking through a graphic novel. You know, the visuals and the text feel like a book, you know, my 12-year-old might read. And yet, you know, deeply smart and intelligent, the way everything is framed. And then individual figures, again, like characters in a graphic novel, who tell the story of running away from the fire, 14-year-old, 12-year-old, you know, a teenager, that are based on actual people, you know, from that moment, actual Chicagoans, which is really powerful. So I applaud those efforts. It's not easy to think about, you know, the experience of younger people, walking through an exhibition.
Right. Again, you have to, they're so good, and that exhibition is so good about talking about it as a human event.
That's right. That's right.
You have to think in those terms, as well as these larger terms we've been talking about.
I mean, because there are these existential questions, of course, that we can't answer, which is like, why are we fascinated by dramatic, traumatic events? You know, what is it? Why are we drawn to the kind of horror and violence of this moment, right? I mean, no Chicagoan, I would imagine, cannot acknowledge the fire in some way, or doesn't know something about the fire. And yet we do need to tell and retell this history for our moment now, again and again, and also rethink how it's been learned or taught, right?
Well, and the way we retell it many times tells much more about us than it does about them.
Right. Well, that's a question probably you'll only be able to answer and decades from now, is how we're having this conversation and why. But I want to end on this note. We only have a few moments left about commemoration, and how we mark the fire now, how we might do that, or how it has been done, or how it can be done better. I wonder if you all have answers to that. What would be a good way to commemorate the fire?
I think things like the exhibition that Julius put on. I mean, again, the thing that tries to go back and try to, we're going to say, demythologize it and understand it in a deeply human way. For years that even the History Museum would have a woman lead a cow, again, to kind of just fall back on not the fire, but the story of the mythology of the fire. And Mrs. O'Leary is a kind of figure of comic folklore rather than a serious consideration of what was involved. And I think Julius and CHM did a very, very good job with that.
I think that one of the things that would be important in terms of thinking about any future commemorative, either physical or performative or multimedia, is to really interrogate what it means to be so committed to drawing a lesson about unity coming out of the fire, rather than acknowledging that there were feats of capacity that were extraordinarily admirable, given the challenges and the circumstances that were there, that clearly it established a destiny for a recapitalization and a rebuilding and a repurposing of a city that was going to then grow exponentially. It's 3 times the size of its population in 1871 by 1900. But I feel like Chicago's, kind of go-to in terms of thinking about key civic events is that things were unified, whether it's under a political organization or whether it's in response to a disaster. And I think there's much more rich to learn, precisely in the way that Julius was just suggesting, about kind of taking in the kaleidoscope of human experiences and human interests that are laid bare whenever something really confronts and challenges and takes down a structure of society and affords the opportunity to kind of bring something else in its place. We should learn to embrace the difference that we can learn from that story, rather than always feeling like we have to draw a lesson of unity from it.
Yes, well put. I know there are many other questions in the Q&A, and I will say that those questions are definitely answered both through this exhibition and in Carl's book. So I urge you to check them both out. And I just want to thank the three of you for gathering this evening for this discussion. There's deep interest in this moment in Chicago history. Lots of people asking questions of all varieties. So we have scraped the surface here, but it's been very, very, very rich for me to hear your responses, and I'm sure everybody else agrees. So thank you so much. Thanks to CHM, the Chicago Collections Consortium, and to the three of you, Carl, Julius, and Adam. And thank you everybody for joining us this evening. A recording of this program will be available on the Newberry's YouTube channel really soon. And like this one, all Newberry programs remain free and open to the public, thanks to the generosity of our donors. We really need the support of our entire community, so please support the Newberry by making a gift today, which you can do online at newberry.org/give. Please join us for our next virtual program, which is called African American Composers and the Black Renaissance. This will take place on Tuesday, November 9th at noon Central Time. Now, this event is being held in conjunction with the current exhibition, which is up at the Newberry Library. It's called Chicago Avant-Garde, 5 Women Ahead of Their Time. This exhibition is also free and open to the public. You can go check it out in person at 60 West Walton Street. Thank you all for joining us. Good night.